Marissa had never felt more alone. It was late in the evening, and she was driving down a quiet road in a small suburban neighborhood. The night sky was clear, the air crisp, but there was a sense of unease creeping into her mind. She had just left a party at a friend's house and was heading home, but something about the way the streetlights flickered and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally made her feel like she was being watched. Her car hummed softly as it cruised down the road. The streets were empty, save for a few houses with their lights dimmed, most of the neighborhood fast asleep. It was a peaceful scene at first glance, but as Marissa glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw the flashing blue and red lights of a police car. Her heart skipped a beat. Marissa wasn't speeding, and she hadn't done anything wrong. She thought maybe the officer was just pulling someone else over, but when she saw the second police car following close behind, her stomach tightened. Her instinct told her something wasn't right. She turned onto the next street, hoping to shake them off, but the second police car stuck right behind her. "Don't panic," Marissa whispered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. She had been through a routine traffic stop before, and she knew how to handle it. But tonight, with the air colder than usual and the streets eerily quiet, she had a gut feeling that tonight wouldn't be like the others. Finally, she decided to pull over and park along the curb. The sound of her car's engine idling was deafening in the silence. She sat still for a moment, glancing through the rearview mirror as the two police cars parked behind her, blocking her in. Her palms began to sweat, and she took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. The officers stepped out of their vehicles. They were tall, with dark sunglasses on despite the late hour. They approached her car with a sense of authority, their movements stiff and methodical, as if this were just another routine traffic stop for them. But for Marissa, everything felt wrong. She rolled through the day as the weeks went by. Marissa's life began to change in ways she never expected. The shock of the attack had faded, but the impact it left on her was something she carried every day. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars remained. Yet, despite the pain and the uncertainty of the future, she felt a sense of determination growing within her. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had suffered in silence, everyone who had been oppressed, and everyone who had been ignored. Her journey wasn't just about seeking justice for what happened to her, it was about making sure that others didn't have to go through the same thing. She wanted her story to be a catalyst for change, not just a tragedy to be mourned. It was a heavy responsibility, but Marissa felt stronger with each passing day. She knew that the fight wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready. The trial of Officer Roberts and Officer Duncan began, and Marissa found herself at the center of it all. Her testimony was the key to the case, and the weight of speaking out in front of a courtroom full of people was overwhelming. She had relived the experience so many times, but hearing her own words in the courtroom felt different. It was no longer just her pain, it was a public reckoning. When Marissa took the stand, she felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. It was almost too much to bear, but she stood tall, holding her head high, and began to speak. Her voice was steady, but there was a rawness to it as she recounted everything that had happened that night. The officers who had attacked her sat across the room, their eyes avoiding hers. They couldn't look at her. She had found the strength to look them in the eyes, to hold them accountable for what they had done. As she spoke, Marissa could feel the support of the crowd, the people who had rallied behind her from the very beginning. She wasn't just testifying for herself, she was testifying for everyone who had been hurt, for everyone who had been silenced. She had never felt more empowered in her life. The trial was intense, and it dragged on for several weeks. The defense team tried to discredit Marissa, questioning her every word, making her relive the trauma of that night over and over again. But Marissa was unwavering. She wasn't going to let them twist her truth. She wasn't going to let them dismiss her pain. She had come too far. Every day after court, Marissa would retreat to the safety of her home, where she could reflect and recharge. She would talk to her family, her friends, and her supporters, who kept her grounded. They reminded her that she was not alone in this fight, that her voice mattered, and that her courage was making a difference. The pressure of the trial weighed on her, but she knew that she had to keep going. The stakes were too high. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. The jury deliberated for hours, and Marissa spent those hours anxiously waiting for the verdict. It felt like the longest wait of her life. The world outside seemed to stop, and she could barely breathe as she sat with her family, holding on to the hope that justice would be served. When the jury finally returned, Marissa's heart raced. The room fell silent as the judge called for the verdict to be read aloud. Marissa held her breath, her hands clenched in anticipation. The words that followed would change everything. Officer Roberts and Officer Duncan are found guilty on all charges, the judge announced. A wave of relief washed over Marissa, but it was quickly followed by a sense of disbelief. She had done it. They had done it. The officers who had harmed her were now held accountable for their actions. It was a moment of victory, but it wasn't the end. The battle for justice was far from over, and Marissa knew that the real work was just beginning. The news spread quickly, and Marissa's story became a symbol of resilience. It wasn't just the fact that the officers had been convicted, it was the way Marissa had stood up, the way she had found her voice in the face of fear, and the way she had turned her trauma into a force for change. In the months that followed, Marissa continued to advocate for police reform. She spoke at rallies, met with lawmakers, and worked alongside civil rights organizations to push for change. Her efforts were gaining momentum, and she could see the shift beginning to take place. People were listening. The conversation about police brutality and racial injustice was no longer a quiet one. It was loud, and it was impossible to ignore. But even as Marissa fought for change, she was still learning to heal. The trauma of that night had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She had been through something unimaginable, and she had come out stronger on the other side. She found solace in the small moments, the laughter of her friends, the support of her family, the quiet moments of peace where she could just breathe. Marissa's journey wasn't just about the fight for justice, it was about reclaiming her sense of self, about finding strength in the face of adversity, and about using her voice to empower others. She had faced the worst that life could throw at her, and she had emerged with a newfound sense of purpose. And through it all, Marissa never forgot why she was doing this. It wasn't for the recognition, the headlines, or the applause. It was for the people who had been silenced, for the families who had lost loved ones, and for the communities that had been torn apart by injustice. She was fighting for a world where people didn't have to live in fear, where their voices were heard, and where they were treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. In the end, Marissa knew that the fight wasn't over. The road to justice was long, and there would be setbacks along the way. But she was ready. She had found her voice, and nothing would silence her again. As she stood before a crowd of supporters at a rally months after the trial, Marissa looked out at the sea of faces, people who had been touched by her story, people who had come together to fight for a better future. Her heart swelled with pride, and she knew that her journey was far from over. The fight for justice was just beginning, and she would be there every step of the way, fighting for what was right, for what was fair, and for the change that was long overdue. Ys that followed felt like a blur to Marissa. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the flashing lights, the shouts of the officers, and the overwhelming fear that had gripped her when she thought she wouldn't make it out of that situation. But now, as the dust began to settle, she was starting to understand that this wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger, something that had the potential to change things for people who had been suffering in silence for far too long. She had been kept in a safe house for a few days, away from the media frenzy and the public eye. During that time, Marissa met with the FBI, her lawyer, and even a few civil rights leaders who had heard about her case. They were all incredibly supportive, offering her a network of resources and guidance, but Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of the situation was pressing down on her shoulders. Each conversation with the FBI agents or her lawyer seemed to bring more details to light. The officers who had attacked her, Officer Roberts and Officer Duncan, were not only under investigation for her assault, but they had been involved in multiple incidents of racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power. Marissa learned that the officers had been part of a larger network of corrupt individuals within the police department, and the FBI had been tracking them for months. It was shocking to realize that what happened to her wasn't an isolated incident. There had been others, people who had been hurt or unjustly targeted in ways that weren't being reported or addressed. As the information piled up, Marissa realized that her story could be a turning point in a much larger fight. She had experienced firsthand the kind of discrimination and violence that so many others faced, and now, she had the chance to be a voice for those who hadn't been able to speak up. It was a heavy responsibility, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to make a real difference. But with that realization came a wave of fear. The fear of facing the public, of reliving the pain and humiliation of what had happened, of being judged or misunderstood. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of attention. Yet, in her heart, she knew that she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. A week after the incident, Marissa's lawyer suggested that she make a public statement. The officers had been arrested and were now facing charges, but the public still needed to know what had happened to her. The pressure to speak up weighed on Marissa, and though she was still processing everything, she knew it was the right thing to do. The case had gained national attention, and people were waiting to hear from her. She needed to be strong not just for herself, but for others who had been through similar experiences. The decision to speak out wasn't easy, but it was something she felt compelled to do. So, Marissa sat down with her lawyer and the public relations team, preparing for her first public appearance since the incident. She went over her statement multiple times, making sure it was clear, calm, and honest. She wanted people to understand that this wasn't just a personal issue, it was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. The day of her statement, the media descended on the press conference. Reporters from all over the country were there, cameras flashing, microphones raised, all waiting for her to speak. Marissa felt a knot in her stomach as she stepped up to the podium. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, but she pushed the fear aside. She had a job to do, and she was determined to do it. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never imagined I would be standing here, telling my story like this, but I know it's important. What happened to me isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who have been treated unfairly, who have been hurt, and who have felt powerless because of the color of their skin." Her voice cracked for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I was targeted by 2 police officers who abused their power. I was threatened, assaulted, and humiliated, simply because I am black. And while I was lucky enough to have the FBI intervene and bring them to justice, so many others don't have that same opportunity. This is bigger than me. This is about everyone who has ever been hurt by those who are supposed to protect us." Marissa took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she held the microphone. "I'm not standing here for sympathy. I'm standing here because I believe in justice. I believe in change. And I believe that we can do better, as a country, as a community, and as human beings. We can't allow this to continue. We can't allow more people to suffer in silence. We need to stand together, and we need to make our voices heard." The room fell silent as Marissa finished her statement. The reporters were still, the cameras still rolling. For a few moments, it felt like time had stopped. Then, the questions came. They were all asking the same thing: what's next? What can be done to prevent this from happening again? Marissa wasn't sure what the answer was, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. Her story had opened a door, and she was going to walk through it, no matter how hard it might be. She was determined to make sure that the officers who had hurt her would be held accountable, and that the system that had allowed their behavior to go unchecked would change. The public response was overwhelming. Protests erupted in cities across the country, demanding justice not just for Marissa, but for all those who had been victims of police brutality and racism. People of all backgrounds came together to support her, and Marissa felt the weight of their collective strength. She wasn't alone. There were thousands of others who felt the same way, who shared the same pain, and who were ready to fight for change. In the days that followed, Marissa began working with civil rights organizations, using her voice to advocate for police reform, racial justice, and accountability. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she was ready for it. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a fighter, a voice for those who had been silenced, and a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt powerless. The pain of what had happened to her would never go away completely, but Marissa had found a new sense of purpose. She had turned her trauma into a powerful tool for change, and as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, she knew that her fight was just beginning. WN her window. The noise grew louder as Marissa tried to catch her breath, her heart racing from the physical and emotional toll of the moment. She was still on her knees in the dirt, trying to process what had just happened. The lights from the flashing sirens painted the street in harsh hues of red and blue, and for the first time since this all began, Marissa felt a spark of hope. The next few moments felt like a whirlwind for Marissa. The FBI agents moved quickly, their presence calm but filled with authority. She had never imagined a scenario like this. FBI agents at her side, the two officers who had assaulted her now in handcuffs and led away from the scene. The night had gone from terrifying to surreal in the blink of an eye, and Marissa could barely comprehend what had just happened. The agent who had helped her earlier sat beside her in the small, secure room. He had asked her to stay calm, and though her heart was still racing from the shock, she couldn't help but notice how the entire situation had shifted in an instant. The fear that had overwhelmed her only minutes ago seemed to slowly fade as the reality set in. She was safe, at least for now. Marissa tried to wrap her mind around what had happened, but it was difficult to think straight. She kept replaying the scene in her head, the police officers pulling her over, their cruel words, the violence that had followed. She could still feel the weight of their hands on her, pushing her face into the dirt, and the suffocating sense of helplessness that had gripped her. But now, as she sat in the safe house, a sense of relief began to settle over her. "Are you okay?" the agent asked, his voice gentle but direct. He was tall and had an air of quiet professionalism, yet his eyes conveyed empathy. Marissa nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure if she believed her own answer. The physical pain from the encounter was fading, but the emotional scars would take longer to heal. I think I'm okay," she said quietly, her voice still shaky. "It's just hard to believe this is happening." The agent gave her a reassuring smile. "It's understandable. This isn't something anyone should have to go through. You've been incredibly strong." Marissa appreciated the kindness, but she knew she had a long way to go before she could feel normal again. The sense of powerlessness still lingered in the back of her mind. She was grateful for the FBI's intervention, but there was still a burning question she couldn't shake: why had this happened in the first place? As if sensing her thoughts, the agent spoke again, his tone becoming more serious. "The officers who attacked you are under investigation. We've been monitoring them for some time, and this incident only confirms the suspicions we had." Marissa looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Were they targeting me specifically?" The agent nodded slowly. "They've been involved in other incidents like this, and we've been building a case against them. Unfortunately, some officers abuse their power, and it's our job to hold them accountable. What happened to you was awful, but it's not something we take lightly." Marissa felt a lump form in her throat. She had always been told that police officers were there to protect people, to uphold justice. But now, the truth was clear to her, at least some of them didn't see it that way. The realization was overwhelming, but the agent's words brought her some comfort. She wasn't alone in this fight. As the minutes passed, Marissa found herself staring out the window, lost in thought. She had never imagined her life taking such an unexpected turn. She had been doing nothing more than driving home from a friend's house, yet now her story was part of something much bigger, a national conversation about police brutality and the need for justice. Her heart ached for the countless others who hadn't been as lucky as she had been, who had suffered without anyone coming to their aid. The agent's voice broke through her thoughts. "We've arranged for you to speak with a counselor if you want. It's important to process what happened, and we're here to support you in any way we can." Marissa didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure if she was ready to talk about everything that had just happened. The pain was still fresh, and the idea of reliving it was daunting. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't keep it all inside forever. "I think I might want to talk to someone," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. The agent nodded in understanding and quickly made arrangements. Marissa appreciated the offer, knowing that she couldn't carry the weight of everything alone. Meanwhile, outside the safe house, the scene was chaotic. News vans had started to arrive, their cameras trained on the area, capturing every moment. Marissa had heard the sound of shouting in the distance as protesters gathered, demanding justice. The world had already begun to notice what had happened to her, and she felt a mix of gratitude and dread. Gratitude because it meant people cared, but dread because she wasn't sure if she was ready for the spotlight that would surely come with it. As the hours passed, Marissa began to settle in the room, the adrenaline from the night's events slowly wearing off. She knew that the investigation into the officers would continue, but she also knew that this was just the beginning of her journey. What had happened to her wasn't something she could forget, but it was something she could turn into a force for change. She began to realize that her story wasn't just her own. It was a story that many others had experienced, people of color, people who had been unfairly targeted, treated with suspicion, or worse, by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Marissa knew that she had to use her voice, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced by fear or oppression. The counselor arrived later that evening, and though Marissa was nervous, she felt a little more at ease with the idea of talking. She needed to express the emotions she had bottled up for so long, but she didn't know where to start. The counselor was patient and kind, guiding her through the process without pushing her too hard. It felt strange, at first, but as the session went on, Marissa felt herself opening up, sharing the details of what had happened and how it had affected her. For the first time in hours, she felt like she wasn't carrying this burden alone. When the session ended, the counselor reassured her that it was okay to take things one step at a time. "Healing isn't a race," the counselor said gently. "You're allowed to feel everything you're feeling. And we'll be here to support you every step of the way." Marissa nodded, grateful for the support. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time since the incident, she felt a sense of hope rising within her. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew she wouldn't be walking it alone. The next morning, as the news of the incident spread across the country, Marissa's phone began to ring. Calls from journalists, calls from lawyers, and even calls from strangers who had heard about what happened and wanted to offer their support. But for now, Marissa wasn't ready to speak to the media. She knew there would be time for that later. For now, she needed to focus on her healing, on finding peace in the chaos, and on reclaiming her voice. As she looked out the window once more, she saw the first rays of sunlight breaking through the darkness. The world outside was still spinning, but for Marissa, something had changed. The fight for justice was just beginning, and she was ready to face it head on. The two officers who had been tormenting her were frozen, staring at the new arrivals. More cars pulled up, their lights casting sharp shadows that stretched across the pavement. In the distance, the sound of helicopter blades chopping the air added to the chaos. Marissa didn't understand what was happening, but the tension in the air had shifted. Something had changed, and she felt a glimmer of relief, though her body still trembled from what she had just endured. "Step away from her," came a voice, stern and commanding. Marissa looked up, still dazed, and saw the figures of FBI agents moving quickly toward the officers. The two police officers who had been harassing her now stood completely still, their hands raised as if they were unsure of what to do next. One of the agents moved swiftly to Marissa's side. "Are you okay?" the agent asked gently, but Marissa could hardly speak. She nodded slowly, though she still felt dizzy and disoriented. Her hands trembled as she wiped the dirt from her face, still trying to process the reality of what was unfolding. The FBI agents surrounded the two officers, their movements controlled and precise. Marissa could hear them talking to the officers in low voices, but she couldn't quite make out the words. She was still too shaken to process everything happening around her. The air felt thick with tension, and it seemed like everything was moving in slow motion. Marissa didn't know how long it had been since the FBI agents arrived, but it felt like a surreal dream. The sounds of sirens and helicopters began to fade into the background, and the immediate danger that had loomed over her moments before seemed to dissipate. The agents moved with purpose, speaking to the officers in a way that showed their authority, their words commanding without being loud. One of the FBI agents knelt beside her, offering her a hand. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said softly. Marissa looked at the agent's outstretched hand for a moment before taking it. The agent helped her to her feet, his grip strong and steady as she rose, still trying to gather her bearings. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, but also confusion. What had just happened? Why were the FBI involved? As she was led away from the scene, Marissa noticed the officers being handcuffed, their faces a mix of disbelief and anger. They were being detained, but it felt unreal to her. She had never imagined such a moment in her life, not in a million years. As she walked toward one of the FBI vehicles, she heard murmurs from the crowd that had started to gather at the edge of the street. People had been watching from their windows and doorways, many of them having seen what happened or heard the commotion. Marissa was escorted into a safe house, a small, secure location where she was given a seat and immediately offered water. The FBI agents gave her space to breathe and recover from the ordeal, but they remained nearby, speaking softly to each other in the background. The agent who had helped her sat across from her, his expression serious. "We're going to take care of everything," he assured her. "You're safe now." Marissa could barely focus on his words. The past few minutes felt like they had happened in a blur, the violence, the fear, the officers' cruelty, and then the sudden shift in the air when the FBI arrived. She tried to calm her racing heart, but her body was still in shock, her mind struggling to catch up with the events that had unfolded. The agent handed her a phone. "This is a secure line," he explained. "You can make any calls you need to make, but for now, we need you to stay here while we handle the situation outside." Marissa nodded absently, her hands still shaking as she held the phone. She felt like she had been through a lifetime in the span of just a few minutes. But the feeling of safety that the FBI brought with them was something she hadn't felt before. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. "Do you want to speak with your family?" the agent asked gently. Marissa nodded again, though she didn't know how to explain to her parents what had just happened to her. How could she? How could she explain that the officers who were supposed to protect her had instead turned on her, using their power to hurt and humiliate her in ways that made no sense? She dialed her mother's number, and after a few rings, her mother picked up. "Marissa," her mother's voice came through, full of concern. "Where are you? Are you okay?" I'm okay, Mom," Marissa said, her voice trembling as the words left her mouth. "I'm safe now, but something happened." Something terrible. I. I need you to listen. Her mother fell silent on the other end of the line. Marissa took a deep breath before continuing, trying to calm the emotions that were rising inside her. The cops they stopped me. They were so rough, and then they did things. They hurt me, Mom. Her voice cracked as she said it out loud. But the FBI they came, and they arrested them. Her mother didn't say anything for a moment, but Marissa could hear the sharp intake of breath. I'll be there soon, her mother said, her voice filled with panic and concern. Stay with the FBI. We'll figure this out. I will, Mom, Marissa reassured her, wiping her eyes as she held the phone. I'm safe. The agent who had been sitting across from her gave her a soft, reassuring smile. You did the right thing by reaching out, he said. We're going to help you through this. Marissa nodded again, trying to take in everything that had happened. The world outside seemed so distant, so foreign to her now. She couldn't comprehend the idea that she had been targeted just because of who she was, just because of the color of her skin. But the anger she felt was starting to settle, replaced by a quiet determination. She had survived this, and now it was time to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. As she sat there, trying to process what had happened, the FBI agents worked quickly to secure the area outside. The two officers who had attacked her were now in custody, but Marissa knew that her journey was far from over. She had a long road ahead of her, one filled with difficult conversations, tough decisions, and a fight for justice. But she wasn't going to let fear control her. Not anymore. The road to healing, to justice, would be long. But with the support of the FBI and the people who cared for her, Marissa knew she wasn't walking it alone. Evening, ma'am, one officer said, his voice gruff but polite. License and registration, please. Marissa nodded and fumbled for her purse, her hands shaking slightly as she grabbed her documents. She handed them over, offering a small smile, trying to appear calm despite the growing knot in her stomach. Everything okay? She asked, trying to break the tense silence. The officer didn't respond, only nodded and walked back to his car with her papers. The second officer stood by her window, his eyes scanning the interior of the car as if searching for something. Marissa felt his gaze linger uncomfortably, a cold shiver creeping down her spine. He didn't speak, just kept watching her as the seconds dragged on. It was only a moment later that the first officer returned with her documents in hand, but his expression had changed. No longer polite, there was a trace of annoyance in his eyes. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am, the officer said firmly, without explanation. Marissa felt a surge of confusion. Is everything okay? What did I do wrong? She asked, her voice shaking. She had never been in a situation like this before, and now she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creep into her chest. We'll talk outside, the officer replied, his tone cold. Marissa hesitated. She had always been taught to comply with the police, but something about the situation didn't sit right with her. But she had no choice. She unlocked the door and slowly stepped out of the car, her legs feeling weak beneath her. The second officer immediately grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the car. You've been acting suspicious, he said, his grip tightening. What's your business in this neighborhood? Marissa was taken aback. She hadn't been speeding or breaking any laws. She was simply on her way home, trying to mind her own business. I was just coming from a friend's house, she said, trying to explain. The officer didn't listen. You think you can just drive around here without being questioned, he spat, his voice rising. You think you can do whatever you want? Marissa's heart raced. I'm just trying to go home, she said, her voice small now, the fear settling in her chest. Please, I haven't done anything wrong. But the officer wasn't interested in listening. With a sudden jerk, he pushed her against the side of the car, forcing her to face the vehicle. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and her pulse quickened. Marissa could hear the other officer in the background muttering something to his partner, but the words were muffled. She was still in shock, her body stiff from the officer's rough handling. "Please, let me go," Marissa pleaded, her voice shaky. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officers exchanged a look before the second officer began to speak again, his voice filled with venom. "You think we don't know what you're really doing here," he sneered. "You're out here causing trouble." Marissa had no idea what he was talking about. She had never been in trouble with the law before. "I'm just trying to get home," she cried out, but it was like her words didn't matter. The officer's harsh treatment only intensified. They shoved her face first into the dirt, pressing her down hard enough that she could barely breathe. Her mind spun in confusion, her body struggling to fight against the weight of their force. It felt as though time had frozen. She had no idea what to do, trapped under their control with no one around to help her. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from the physical pain but from the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. She had done nothing to deserve this treatment. Nothing at all. But as the officers continued their assault, Marissa did the only thing she could think of. She reached out for her strength, focusing on her will to survive. With a burst of energy, she managed to wriggle her face out of the dirt, gasping for air. For a split second, everything seemed to stop. It was then that Marissa heard something unusual, a faint but unmistakable sound of helicopters in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Suddenly, flashing blue and red lights filled the street, and she heard the voice of another officer shouting commands. The situation had just changed dramatically. The officers who had been so sure of their control now stood frozen, their faces full of confusion. It wasn't just another police car arriving, it was the FBI. Marissa blinked, not fully understanding what was happening. The chaos unfolded around her, and in those moments, the weight of the officer's cruelty seemed to lift.